to our audience. I am Laura Hart, the CEO and founder of Robo Fund, and I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Martin from UMass Lowell.
Hi, everyone.
Fred is both an associate dean as well as a computer science professor. And Fred,
this is my 20th year at UMass Lowell.
Woohoo! That's
Yep.
exciting. That's exciting.
Is.
It's my 23rd year being a business owner.
Good for you, Laura.
So before we get started, I'll tell everybody a little bit about Robo Fund, and then we will turn things over to talking about AI from a technological positivist's point of view. I loved that phrase.
I still believe technology is our best hope for the future.
All right. All right. So Robo Fund, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a place on the Upper West Side of Manhattan where we help children love to learn using leading edge technologies such as programming or coding, robotics, animation, and some work with Minecraft and circuitry. And we run classes in person. We're still socially distanced. We know kids are about to get vaccinated, but we're still doing really small classes in really big classrooms. And we do that in person. We do that online, and we also do it in many, many schools in New York City. If you go to robofund.org, sign up for our mailing list. We do some free things, some classes we're trying out, and you also just get on our mailing list and know what we're doing. That's robofund.org, and we do classes, birthday parties, private lessons, both in the studio, online, and at schools. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fred Martin, who every single time I have a conversation with Fred, I leave going, wow, that's another thing I hadn't thought about. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here with us.
Thanks, Laura.
And our topic is, let's talk about what is artificial intelligence and what isn't artificial intelligence. So why don't we start with that very small question?
Yeah, sure. Well, small question, right? Well, I think, of course, AI has had a lot of mythology around it since its inception. The term came about in the late 1950s, and it's had great branding ever since it first got started. And so, of course, just even the term itself makes us think of something distinctly human, which is our intelligence. And so then when we assume, and back in the 50s and 60s, the big computers were called computer brains, right? The refrigerator-sized machines, and so we've been using this like metaphor of the computer as a brain, as an intelligence since the whole term was invented. And so there's a lot of mythology that like the AI is going to take over, and of course sci-fi. It's a major theme of sci-fi. Laura and I were talking, and I think probably many people in this audience remember the movie with Hal, who takes over the space station, is that glowing red orb like a giant eye, and he's like, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." Right. So this idea of the AI becoming sentient and taking over, that's a big part of how people have been taught to think about AI. And I mean, so this is more of a philosophical and religious and spiritual question. What is sentience and self-awareness? It's not so, I don't think it's so much of a science question. At least we haven't constructed it as such yet. But I'm personally not worried about it at all. There's a guy's name is there's a guy's name is Ray Kurzweil. He's most famous for having created a lot of the electronic keyboards in the 1970s.
Yep.
And he's also famous for having coined this term called the singularity, which is the moment when the AI systems become self-aware and start to do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. And again, basically, the AI systems that we're building now are just stupid programs at the level of thinking about intelligence.
Okay. And I, before you go any further, who coined the term AI?
Yeah, I think the person's name is John McCarthy, a famous computer scientist. They had some like retreat conferences with the leading researchers of the time. I think, again, this is in the 50s. An earlier term was cybernetics, which is about the way that animals and human systems, any organism is a feedback system that
Mhm.
receives input
Mhm.
and then processes it and then creates actions in the world.
Mhm.
And so things like being able to the way a moth is drawn to a flame is these very low level responses that don't require intelligence. But that cause a feedback system where the organism gravitates towards the flame.
Hmm.
And so and that really leads to AI, because the whole idea of AI is a system that receives input, makes decisions, and then takes actions.
Okay. Receives input, makes decisions, takes action.
Yeah,
So it's like the simplest line of a computer program. If X happens, then Y, in a way.
right. And then the question is, what sort of actions can it take?
Right.
And so
That's the $64 million question, really.
with the cybernetic systems and AI systems now, like AI is actually connected to the world. So, and that to me is what's really new in the last, let's say, 10 years or so. That for many years we've had automated decision making. We've designed our laws, and many of our decision systems they're automatic. If you think of much of college admissions, it's based on grades and SAT realms where, but the whole idea of measuring people objectively, that's the thing that goes way back. If you think of like the idea of an intelligence quotient, which is about 100 years old,
Right.
and and if you think about standardized tests, the SAT itself, when it was first when it was first invented, it was meant to be an equalizing thing. It was meant to be to give kids a chance who didn't come from prep schools. They could
Right.
demonstrate their intelligence, and for most of the history of the SAT, that's the way we've thought about it. But now we realize the SAT is effectively a proxy for family wealth. So it's not measuring something innate about the person. It's measuring something about the circumstances in which they grew up.
Right.
And so we've realized that this thing that was originally conceived as a fairness measure is completely unfair.
Okay. Back to AI, which I completely agree with you about the SATs, and you know, um, but if we go to a hypothetical college could use just grades and use a stupid AI system to track the kids, this group above 80 or 90, we should consider accepting them. This group between 70 and 80, we got to look further. And hopefully a human would then get involved. Is that a hypothetical way to look at how AI could function?
Well, right. I mean, so the thing that changes the conversation with AI is when AI is actually making the recommendation for you.
Uh-huh.
And so um, a- and then if people actually do review the decision or not, or is the decision directly connected to the world? So if
Okay,
we look at,
I think I have a perfect example, which
okay,
would be not for kids yet, but credit scores.
yep,
So my guess is that my credit score is completely determined by AI.
yeah, that's right. It's automated decision making.
Right.
A few years ago, I bought a life insurance policy, and it was actually fair. It was a pretty expensive. The value of it was high. It's term life, but basically, I just answered a whole bunch of questions, and then the system has data on me, and so like I didn't need a medical exam, right? So that and that's I mean, and this is actuarial science, right? They were determining what's my likelihood of you know of having cashing it in or not, and then how much is it going to cost.
Mhm.
And so right, it's all math, and then the system made a decision without any human intervention.
Okay, you just used a term which I missed on what all of that is called.
Oh, the actuarial math, that's the math associated with risk.
Right, there was something else. We'll come back to it. So when we talk, so we've talked about defining AI. We've talked about some of the myths of AI. Um, we should touch a little more on what should people be aware of in terms of this. I think it was an automated decision process. That
Yeah,
might be the term you used that I was thinking.
yeah. Well, so what I'd want to say is that because AI is directly connected to decisions without human intervention, it's actually restructuring our reality in front of us, and we're each perceiving different realities. This
And
is,
that's huge.
yeah, it's kind of a big deal. Yeah, right. And we don't really know much about, we're also very much hidden from the models that are created about each of us that are pretty much owned by companies, and we're not given access to them.
Okay,
Right.
so
So
lead us through a specific example, because
yeah,
everything you're saying is I'm getting it, but I think it might be helpful.
sure. Well, I mean, so the example that most of us are familiar with is when we browse on the webs and the ads we see. And I
Mhm.
think all of us have had the experience of searching for a particular product, and then we start seeing ads for that product.
Right, right, right,
Um,
right, right, right.
so, I mean, that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Of course, what's frustrating about that is then after you buy the thing, you keep seeing ads. You don't want to see them anymore. It's like, why can't it know that I actually bought it so it could stop and do something else? The only way to solve that is just to start searching for a different product. They don't get ads for that new product.
Right.
But that's just a tiny corner of the models that are built on us. So, like, so Laura, if you look in your YouTube account, you'll see the statistics on who's watching the stream. You'll get like aggregate data of this fraction of your audience is this age, is this gender, things like that. And behind the scenes, for each one of us, there's a like particular profile that like, so,
That
Google
YouTube has
knows
about each of us.
Google knows how old you are within 5 years. That definitely knows your gender. It knows your race. It knows also all this stuff.
And we in our government have no regulation of this at this point.
In the U.S. is far behind, in particular Europe, which about 5 years ago enacted this law called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GP, D, GDPR. And now, whenever you go to a website and you get this thing about the cookies being accepted or not, that's thanks to Europe. So at least there's a little bit of an opportunity to have fewer cookies if you're willing to spend like 20 seconds on each website, making sure you check the options for the minimal cookies, then that website will track you a little bit less.
Okay, so most of us go places, we get the damn cookie thing and we say, I agree.
Right.
But I've never not said I agree. So if you
Oh,
don't, so what
well,
happens? Can you
well,
say,
so if there's the option to make choices,
right?
then you'll get this menu where there'll be like some cookies that you have to accept,
Yep.
and
Okay.
then a bunch of cookies that you can decline.
I don't think that's so common. Most of the ones I go to, it's I agree, or you got that little thing at the bottom, but maybe you
Uh-huh.
just accept that you have the thing
Yeah,
at the bottom the whole
look
time.
for the thing. It's generally there's this thing called I'm blanking on the exact name, but it's basically like evil design that it
Makes it
technically
really
gives you the
tiny
option.
compared to the other one.
Yeah.
Right.
Dark design, that's what it's called. Yeah.
One of the okay, I'm gonna throw out a few laurels about when I met you, Fred. You had recently written an article called "The Art of Lego Design."
That
Um,
was a while ago.
that was a really long time ago, like 30 years or 25 years ago. But it was so beautifully written about the precision of how to look at pieces.
The Lego is a beautifully designed system.
Right, right. So,
Right, and I had this experience of discovering the system by helping teach it to kids and learning how to build myself and recognizing all the brilliant ideas that are not obvious. So I was
right,
describing those.
right. Like a connector peg, there's the ones with friction, without friction. And
That's right. Yeah, the black ones and the gray ones.
yep, yep. Yeah. So Fred knows his systems. And you did something about design that I remember. And design is so important to us in looking at and looking at
Oh,
everything.
sure.
So, and what term did you use for that? Evil design, when they make
Oh,
the
it's dark. I remember the correct term is dark design. That's when it's leading you to make choices that are not in your best interests.
so it's the opposite of a nudge, a positive nudge.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So we have GDPR.
Yeah.
And recently we have this thing going on Apple phones, which is positive for us as human beings, as individuals, not so good for me in a company because everyone's starting to opt out of stuff.
So
What's
what do you see directly as a result of that? How does that impact it?
we don't see a lot. We don't have a huge, well, every week I have a marketing meeting and we go through, and you're welcome to come one week if you'd like to see it.
Sure.
And we now know that we don't necessarily know all the clicks on my blogs. We know it's probably higher because people can opt out of us or Google collecting how many people click on it.
Huh. So you have
So
less information about how many people viewed your content.
exactly. And so we assume the number might be slightly higher because people like, I mean, I'm sure you and I, when I have the option of people getting my data, I'm like, no, I don't
Right.
want to have the data. So,
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, that's an AI thing, the recent, how did that happen on Apple phones in the last couple of months? Or you probably don't have an Apple phone because you're an engineer.
Um, so I don't know the inner details, but one of the things that we've learned about data is that a lot of data is proxy for other data. So this thing about SATs is proxy for family wealth. And so I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes, companies are still able to build models, even though they're gathering less data.
Right.
And it's extremely hard to anonymize data because it's so interrelated in many ways that you can figure out, you can actually figure out who individuals are. Even there was this famous case with Netflix where they had a contest to do a better job with the recommendation engine. It's about 10 years ago, and they removed information about who the names of the users. They count names, the real names and the usernames.
Right.
But it was still possible to figure out who individuals are from this data set that they shared. So I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes there's more going on than we think there is.
So in other words, if you remove the social security number and the sort of email of the person, but you know everything else,
Right, exactly.
like where they lived, their zip code, how many kids they had,
Right.
you could then, somebody really smart could somehow connect that to the actual person.
Right, and you could do it automatically too.
Oh, that's not so good. So my last very positive question on this one is, what can we do to change this? Can we? How do you see that?
So I've recently learned that in the United States that states are working to create laws similar to the European law. And already California and Colorado have done so.
Great.
And I met an aide to a state senator last week in Massachusetts who's working on the same. So that will help some. Um, I'm not sure there's a lot that we can do, right? I mean, if once you credit cards, I mean, things that are just so fundamental in modern life, we'd have to set aside, right? We'd have to not carry our phones around. We have to use cash for most transactions. Most of us, it's just so convenient that that's the way we want to live. And the other thing, and we were talking about this, Laura, is that there's all this data being collected upon us about us, and sometimes it can be used for good. We can establish where we were. If we're ever accused of something and we're innocent, there'll be data that shows we weren't there, we were somewhere else, and it'll be compelling data. So I mean, I think a lot of it really has to do with our economic status in society as to how much this is really affecting us.
Well, it's a really interesting topic, and it kind of starts to get towards James Bond, or if you're doing things that you don't want to be tracked, you have to do things without your phone and with cash,
So, I do a lot in K-12 education, and some of the conversations I've had with colleagues recently has to do with digital literacy and understanding of files and file systems. And once you think about this, it's fairly obvious, but kids growing up now basically don't have any interaction with files because everything's in the cloud. Our phones pretty much hide the file system from us. You go to a certain location, all your stuff is there. So this model of directories and individual files and moving files around even though it's absolutely there underneath the hood. I mean, underneath the hood,
Right.
that's how everything still works. But
Right.
most young people have never needed to engage with those things. And
Because
so
they
there's
just
this,
search a word to get what they want.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you log in to your, Google account and all your stuff is there. Maybe you organize it, right? There's less need to organize because of search.
Right.
Um, where things are is very abstract now. So it's interesting to think about digital literacy education. 10 years ago, when I was doing a middle school project in a city that has a lot of kids with low socioeconomic status, the teachers made a point of explaining we need to teach the kids how to use a keyboard and mouse. That's another thing. A lot of kids now, everything's on the phone, particularly kids who don't, low or SES, they don't have computers, regular computers, desktop machines or laptop. And it's still a critical skill. So I think there's real challenges in K-12 education to bring people up to the level that they need to be at to understand how our systems work. To me, the most important thing is knowledge, that people understand how systems work.
So, what you're raising two really important questions. When you talk about digital literacy, do you agree that kids need to learn how to use a keyboard and a mouse?
Yes, absolutely.
And what do you think in terms of this? Was always a hot question when I was a computer teacher. What about teaching touch typing?
Oh, I don't know if that's so important, right? I
Right.
mean, and the voice dictation has gotten really good. So I don't
Yeah.
know about that particularly.
So I think we should schedule another time where we actually talk about digital literacy because I think
Sure.
it's a really interesting topic. But the last comment that you made, do you think kids should learn about file organization?
Yes, it's important to
Yeah.
know how the world works, right? And that's what's behind everything.
Right.
Computing is behind, I mean, this is why computing education is so important, so that people actually, not everyone, most people are not going to be computer science. They're not going to code. I don't code professionally, right? I hardly write code at all now. But I know how things work. And to
Right.
me, that's the most important thing.
Right. Right. Well, we don't have any questions, but I have
Well,
found this.
we can still take them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear. We have a number of people out there listening. Um, please jump in and ask us questions. I go back to how do we change things, and I think we all need to let our elected representatives know what we want um, in terms of privacy. Is there anything out there that's like, here's a manifesto that protects people more?
Here's one that that protects our rights. There's a right to repair movement that is nationwide and local. And I
Mhm.
know my state, Massachusetts, is at the vanguard of it. So this is requiring manufacturers to publish data so that third parties or individuals ourselves can repair our own devices.
Right.
I think
Yeah.
that's really important because pretty much everything now has a computer inside of it,
Right.
and the way our right to use a device is effectively it's a license. So we don't actually
Right.
own the physical things that we use.
So if we
And
open up our iPhone or whatever to change something, we've invalidated the warranty.
when I even change, just repair.
Right.
And so I think that is a really important thing, and that's something concrete that we can work towards.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you know how Europe got so far ahead of us in terms of these issues?
I don't know, but so I have some friends there, and I don't know how much this is part of the political process, but the big companies in tech are all American, so they're basically foreign companies if you're in Europe, right? And
Mhm.
I just imagine that had to be part of it. We don't want these American companies
Right.
controlling us.
Right. But I think it must be deeper about what Europeans, about their being, like what
Hmm.
they expect from companies. And
Yep. Yep.
I think, in a way, Americans allow companies to run us roughshod in some ways. That
Yep.
might be a little too strong a statement, but that Europeans much more have this is the role of an individual, this is the role of a company, more
Yep. That
defined.
sounds right, Lauren.
So, anyway. So we don't have any questions. I love to end my heart to hearts with what's, our life has changed incredibly in the last 16 months, 18 months now. What do you notice differently? You're back at UMass Lowell in person now, right?
Yes, my office. So we are back, and effectively all of our classes are in person. I think not just at my place, and I work with a number of K-12 schools. I'm in touch with school teachers. I think people are under a lot of stress being just continued. I think we thought everything was just going to be fine and normal, and we just have to wear masks, which we do. I'm in my own office, that's why I'm not wearing a mask.
Right.
But I think things are much more challenging than we anticipated. Like, I personally thrive on interpersonal contact. So even though I'm actually in Zoom meetings most of the day,
Right.
and including meetings with colleagues on campus, but
Yeah.
there's an office where I interact with people, and that matters a lot to me. Not everyone's like that. My wife transitioned to a fully virtual job. She does mental health counseling. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she is delighted to be at home and have one client after the next with her virtually. So
Right.
everyone's different.
Right.
I think there's going to be more ways to live moving forward, that we've established how virtual has a lot of affordances and works in many, many ways. And we're going to have a mixture of both.
Yeah, I think you're right. So this has been a fantastic conversation, and we will be in touch, because I totally want to schedule a digital literacy K-12.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'm
All
sure
right.
you have lots to share too, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day, Fred. And for those of you watching, thank you so much. And we look forward to next week's Heart to Heart.
Thanks, okay. Laura. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.